Arteries are a muscle, not a pipe. How we treat artery disease, how we treat this artery that we see on the right hand side is a lot different than how we treat that artery on the, or that vessel that we think it is, on the left hand side. I was there. I mean, I started my career in 1999. I was in total cardiology, and all these cardiologists I was mentored by, they were like, these pipes, we got to open these things up. And the thinking now, that's 20 years ago, like that's years ago, decades ago. The thinking and how we do things now is a lot different. And so how we treat arteries on the right are a lot different than how we think we should be treating them on the left. And today's presentation, I'm going to talk to you specifically about arteries and the process of how it happens. Yes, the artery, if we think about arteries like a pipe, then we could just go in there and throw some liquid Drano down there. We could just scrape it out and pull out all that garbage. It doesn't work that way. These arteries are very complex, they're alive, and you could do more damage than good by going in and poking around, especially in a non-emergent situation. So let's talk about the arterial wall. Arterial wall, it's got a layer of skin to it. Just like the outside lining of our skin, it's got a layer of skin to it. It's called the endothelium, and there are glycocalyx that I'm going to talk about. So these are all new things that even, unfortunately, this is stuff I educate physicians to, and so sometimes your physician may not know what I'm about to talk about. But this is factual stuff about how the arteries are a muscle and not a pipe. And I'm going to teach you about this part of it so you understand, especially when I get into the details of why we do all this testing and how we go about reversing a disease process. This will now all make sense. And so there are infinite number of things that can hurt this arterial wall. There are over 400 different markers, and we don't get into all of those, but here's the top 25 risk factors that can hurt the inside lining of the arterial wall. And so we can read these afterwards, but really what I want to have you understand is there are infinite number of things that can hurt the inside lining of the arterial wall. Infinite number of things. I just talked about the top 25. It all results down to three finite responses. Oxidative stress, and we can see that was on the top 25. So oxidative stress is the big one, immune dysfunction, and we might have heard about inflammation. But oxidative stress and immune dysfunction are sitting on the sidelines, but they're very important. And so I'm going to talk to you about how all of these things come into play and how it's important to test all these things. A lot of doctors or people or even the media is talking about, we got to control inflammation. Absolutely, very important. But that's only one of those three steps. And so as we look at the artery, remember it's all skin, and there's very complex structure that happens here. And these little structures here are called endothelial cells. You can see those little circles there. You can see them on the right-hand side. As I zoom in on this and I go even further, there are something called glycocalyx. Glycocalyx are little fur-like structures that come off the heart. On the left, you can see a nice healthy glycocalyx. It's the first line of defense that happens to a possible injury. And so glycocalyx can sometimes get injured. And that's the first thing that gets injured before the cells or the skin gets injured. And so here on the right, we can see basically an injured glycocalyx or an unhealthy glycocalyx, which is the first line of defense. And so now the endothelium or the skin is super exposed for allowing these atherogenic particles to go through an atherogenic process. I'm going to explain these big words. So atherogenic means plaque causing. Now these particles that float around in your bloodstream, they're not doing any damage until they actually go through the lining. So the common misconception out there is that people think that, ooh, I had a cheeseburger and fries and cholesterol just accumulates to these arterial walls, and I had a last cheeseburger and fries and I end up with a heart attack. It doesn't happen that way. All those cheeseburgers and fries are not good for you. I'm going to explain how that damages the wall of the lining of the arterial wall that then leads to the process of atherosclerosis. And so when we look at these glycocalyx, you can see it's a nice fur-like structure that comes. Here's the endothelial cells. I'm going to go back here. Those are those little circle things there. And those endothelial cells, when they get damaged, what happens is that we start to see the arterial wall get compromised. And so the glycocalyx is the first line of defense that gets injured, and then the endothelial cell. And so I know there's complicated things on these slides, but I really want to take these visuals and have you understand what I'm talking about. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's a healthy glycocalyx, a nice good fur-like structure. On the right-hand side, you can see how they get damaged. So the glycocalyx is damaged and leaving the skin of the arterial wall exposed, the endothelium. So let's talk about the atherosclerotic process. And just so if you've been in our clinic, you understand why and what we're looking for. And so I'm going to get right into this subendothelium, and that's where the blood flows. So let's go right into that level here. And you can see I'm going to show how this plaque happens. So at first, you have these small particles that can cross through this lining of the arterial wall. Now, there are many different types of atherogenic. We call these atherogenic or plaque-causing particles. They're not doing any damage right now, but we definitely want to minimize these inside the bloodstream. That's why cholesterol-lowering statins medications have been given so much hype, is because they lower those particles, but they also lower a lot of good things inside the LDL molecule as well. So I don't want to get into that. That's another talk. But really what I want you to have understand is how the atherogenic process happens. So there are a lot of atherogenic or plaque-causing particles out there. If you've done our testing, we're talking about small dense 3 and 4 particles. We're talking about remnant particles. We're talking about lipoprotein A. These are all particles that are plaque causing. And so what happens at first is that particle seeps through the lining of the skin. And so at first, the skin has got to be injured. Remember those top 25 things or insults that can happen to the arterial wall? Remember, there are over 400 different insults that can happen to the arterial wall. First, the artery's got to be insulted, like it's got to be damaged. The glycocalyx has got to be damaged, the endothelial cells has got damaged, and now it leaves it vulnerable for these atherogenic or plaque-causing particles to come through. And when it does come through, it now goes inside the area what we call the subendothelium. Now, the subendothelium, this is a damaged, an oxidized or a broken down particle. Oxidized. It's an area of no oxygen, right? And so that's why antioxidants are so good for you. And so when we talk about the oxidized, now this is the oxidative process. This particle undergoes an oxidative process where it gets broken down and it gets to become a completely different molecule. And now what happens when that occurs, it undergoes this whole process of being oxidized or broken down. Then a white blood cell comes in. You can see that's floating around in the bloodstream and says, we got an injury, we got an immune response now. And the immune response happens, this white blood cell comes in and eats up that molecule, which is not now the same cholesterol particle that's floating around in the bloodstream. It's completely different. And it then becomes a macrophage. Once it becomes a macrophage, it then becomes a foam cell, and then it becomes a plaque. And this plaque, it's so important. I've summarized 45 different biochemical reactions here in about 6 steps. There are a lot more steps that happen here, but what I really want you to understand is that cholesterol is not the culprit here. It undergoes an atherogenic or plaque building process to build up as this plaque, just like a pimple would on your face. And now the biggest risk that I try and educate to people, remember, the majority of heart attacks and strokes, they occur with blockages that are less than 50%. And so this is where we look at the arterial wall, and we got that pimple that has built up inside the arterial wall. And this is where the blood flows on this side. And now what happens is the blood's flowing, and now that pimple can't hold anymore. Just like that pimple pops on your face, it pops inside an artery, and that is a heart attack.